can read the next one again. This is from Boonge. It says, do you think that U.S. hegemony is faltering? If so, what opportunities might this offer to indigenous communities, both nationally and globally? Hell yeah, it is. I think it's great for indigenous communities nationally and globally. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I think I do think it's faltering, but I think U.S. hegemony in various kind of moments in time has faltered. I think this idea of like a multipolar world, I think while it's an aspiration, I don't think it's a reality. I do think that there's alternatives kind of arising, but and this is kind of based on the interviews that I've done with like people like Vijay Prashad and, listening and reading about the kind of state of the world and like, especially like the war in Ukraine and how there's attempts to kind of create a new like global vision, whether, the kind of the Belt and Road Initiative with China and things like that. But the reality is that like, on one hand, like, I think those are like lofty goals and like, in many ways, like worthy goals to create a new alternative economic system. But I don't think that it's like happening in the way that people, I think there's a lot of, I hate this word, but there's a lot of nuance to that because on one hand, this is happening, right? But then on the other hand, the US dollar isn't just some kind of like free floating kind of currency. It's backed by 800 overseas military bases. And I wouldn't say that we're quite in a unipolar world. I think it's kind of reductive and a mischaracterization, but it's imperialism. And imperialism, I think from the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s to kind of the period of 2001 and the Syrian war, as well as the kind of Ukraine crisis that has ensued, and we're still living through that, the United States has become or was the sole kind of global superpower, and it was able to unilaterally invade Afghanistan, Iraq, and have these kind of extra legal military interventions. And I think it'd be wrong to assume that the United States is in some kind of safe position or has been defanged or declawed, because that's not the truth at all. It's like as violent as ever. I mean, pushing the world to the brink of nuclear war, by arming like fascists and neo-Nazis in Ukraine on one hand, as well as provoking a nuclear power into some kind of like proxy war. That's crazy. That's wild. That's not I don't think that's a symptom of a faltering U.S. hegemony. I think that's just old school, like brinkmanship and kind of callousness on behalf of, of U.S. hegemony and imperialism. Now, like with that in mind, I think it's also important to show that there are alternative anti-neoliberal, anti-U.S. hegemonic projects or counter-U.S. hegemonic projects arising in places like Latin America that do provide breathing room. But here in the United States, I think we've seen a gutting of the left and what could have been an anti-imperialist and anti-colonial kind of leftist movement really being smashed to smithereens by the Biden administration following the George Floyd protests, because everything was co-opted, right? And there was so much appeasement towards the institutions of repression, like the police, the national security state, and in some ways a reconsolidation of power and kind of like an attempt to kind of like use Trump as a boogeyman, but then not doing anything to like actually, adhere to an anti-war or an abolitionist line, but in fact alienating those elements in mischaracterizing. And I would say that what has reconstituted itself as kind of the quote unquote left in the United States with like these online figures, but also people who claim to be socialists, but then uphold like some of the most reactionary social conservative policies. I don't need to name them because everyone knows what I'm talking about, but they have given a reactionary character to what could be considered left and progressive movements in the United States by being anti-trans, by being, anti quote unquote woke. How is it that woke became a movement that challenged and made U.S. hegemony or U.S. power tremble, and now it's become a kind of a defamatory label, right, by people who claim to be progressive and left. And so I would say that while there is kind of a faltering kind of U.S. hegemony, there's also been a kind of a weakening of the left in the United States, and leftism, like actual left politics, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, racial justice, Pan-Africanism, have been relegated to the fringe. And sadly, we're fringe politics. And while these people have, I guess like characterized or caricatured Trumpism or like neo-fascism, they focused a lot of their energy actually on just destroying the left in the name of being left, which is so wild, but it actually makes a lot of sense because there's material incentives to destroy an anti-colonial, anti-racist left and an anti-imperialist left in the United States. And so out of that vacuum, you don't really take serious the threat of fascism and its weird alliance with liberalism. But in fact, what has happened is people have just kind of dressed up liberalism as capitalism and imperialism, which it is in many forms, but they're just anti-liberal. They're not actually anti-capitalist or socialist. They're just anti-liberal. And so that's where you get these weird culture war characters like Glenn Greenwald and other, there's so many that I can't even name all of them. But that's not real anti-imperialist politics. That's not real left politics. That's just culture war. That's anti-liberalism. And Marxists have a critique of liberalism. Indigenous people have a critique of liberalism. But it's not the end goal just to be anti-liberal. That's not the end goal. It's like anti-colonial, decolonization. Those words are now being like banned in public curriculum, right? And there's this kind of limp-wristed, like weak response on behalf of the left or the so-called left, to actually join in the reactionary forces and condemning our side or mischaracterizing it, And so I think it's kind of like, I do think that U.S. Hegemony is faltering in some ways, but that doesn't mean that some kind of like left movement in the United States is going to somehow like, seize this opportunity. I don't think we're in a place to do that right now. In fact, I think the right has made inroads into actually exploiting this crisis better than the left has.
Absolutely. I've been thinking about this a lot. It weighs pretty heavy on me, to be totally honest. And I'm just like, I'm thinking about like how is it that the left is not doing a better job of taking advantage of this moment. And I think it is because like, while also claiming to be not wanting to engage in identity politics or culture wars, it's exactly what people are reproducing. And it's really, really bizarre to me how there's this emphasis on like the individual and individual identities as being the ultimate threat. And I think like when people become obsessed with identity, that definitely like weakens movements. Like I definitely see how like the move to turn inward and focus on yourself as being the highest form of radicalism has like for sure damaged us and for sure weakened us. And that came on heavy during the Biden administration, right? Like during COVID, right after 2020. But I'm wondering, like, do you think that, well, I think another part of like, or I was going to ask, do you think that, the move to kind of push for nuclear war and like, taking advantage of the conflict in the Ukraine that the U.S. is doing, do you think that is a response to the awareness that U.S. hegemony is faltering? Or do you think it's something that would have happened regardless?
I mean, I think like one of the things that you're talking about with this whole identity thing, that's just liberalism, and I think we need to develop a critique and an analysis of liberalism to understand how it can co-opt and redirect potentially radical or transformative forces in any society towards its own ends. It's like the way that the right takes an injury and turns it into a kind of an injury, a perceived injury, and turns it into kind of a broader kind of social grievance and a platform, without ever really changing material conditions. So I think we need to actually be really cognizant of that. as you kind of point out, like what is just liberalism, and like what is actually transformative politics. And some of it, like part of it is like, some of it is like good, like people should heal. You should, if you need to go to therapy, you should be going to therapy, and you should be finding ways to, be healthy, and but also understanding that individual transformation isn't structural or social transformation. And how do you scale up those things, and like collective healing, collective transformation is much more powerful, and like is a movement oriented kind of philosophy than just like, somehow I've like become immune to these kind of trauma politics or whatever it is, because I think that's the way it's easier to kind of outsource the problems of society to an individual than it is to be confronted collectively by the power of the dispossessed, And then to your second point, I don't really know. I mean, it's hard to rationalize elements of a very kind of irrational system, like the kind of logic of nuclear war on the outside of like planetary social annihilation is seemingly, irrational, like in its outcome. But then when you listen to these policymakers and how they're kind of doing a tit for tat, they have an internal logic to their system, right? And that's the scariest part about it, is that there's no checks and balances. There's no like I saw online, there were some people, and I don't know who they are, so I don't know if they're reactionaries or leftists, but they were calling out Ocasio-Cortez for voting for weapons funding package to Ukraine, and pulling us further and further into a nuclear crisis, potential nuclear, war. And I think they're right in that sense, because somebody who does kind of position herself as an outsider to politics, or a progressive, or even a socialist, is actually doing just the opposite. But it also just shows how weak an anti-war movement is in this time, that these people can adopt the label of progressive and socialist and not be held accountable. And it has to occur in this kind of like random incident where like two individuals, who I think were right in calling her out, are just two individuals, and not a real, like, there's no threat to her seat. There's no threat to her, there's not movements putting these people into power. It's a party. It's a democratic party structure. And that's really problematic. And, it's like, it's hard to make kind of changes in that system without having a movement, and having politicians that are accountable to movements, while also recognizing the status quo of the system itself, whether you're Republican or Democrat, is pro-war, is, this kind of brinkmanship politics, is kind of just so anti-Russia, or anti kind of Russia or China, as Biden's new foreign policy platform points out, that they're kind of like aligned as a class, as a political and economic class, to maintain kind of these imperialist policies. And so how do you work and maneuver outside of that system? It's like, I think one is, yes, you have to call them out, but how are you actually building power in an alternative that makes sense? Because we've allowed it to get to a point where nuclear annihilation is much more feasible than universal healthcare. Like, I don't know how more absurd you can get than that. Or land back.
Yeah.
You can imagine the end of the world, but you can't imagine giving Mount Rushmore back, or returning it to its original, state.
Right.